Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's seminar on the future of the digital turn in the new literacy studies. Today's speaker is Professor Kathy Mills. Professor Mills is Professor of Literacies and Digital Cultures at the Institute for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education at the Australian Catholic University in Brisbane. Her research is about gaps in current knowledge and educational applications of multimodality, multiliteracies, sensory literacies, and related theories of digital media practices in education. Professor Mills has published over 100 academic works and is the winner of many award and research grants. Dear Kathy, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to your students. I know you're from a range of different fields, and so I hope that there is something in this presentation that all of you can be inspired by. And I hear some of you are in the field of education, some in digital media, and I can see other touch points as well. So hopefully this will be of use to you in your PhD journey. So the question today is, what is the future of the digital turn in the new literacy studies? And this is based on an article I published in 2010 in the Review of Educational Research, which accumulated a massive, I guess, overview of all the studies that had occurred in this space. And it raised some important questions for education, for society, and for understanding what is the nature of literacy and how is it changing. So I want to first of all introduce a robotic voice of GLaDOS, which is from a popular video game called Portal that my son used to play, and you may be familiar with this game.
Hello, and again, welcome to the Aperture Science Computer-Aided Enrichment Center. We hope your brief detention in the relaxation vault has been a pleasant one. Your specimen has been processed, and we are now ready to begin the test proper. Before we start, however, keep in mind that although fun and learning are the primary goals of all Enrichment Center activities,
And this is a video of my youngest child when she was just 5. She's much older now. And she said she was going to do the voice of GLaDOS while sight reading a book called Scratch the Kitten Goes to Sea.
A long time for Scratch to comb his leathers, but a few hours later he crawled out of his hiding place and sniffed the salty air. No slinking dogs, no nagging brothers and sisters, just the splashing of the waves and the flapping of the sails, the shouting of the sailors and the cries of the seagulls high above the mast.
So there are two things I want to draw your attention to here. The first is that literacy and the digital world are no longer separate entities. Even this reading of a printed book is a hybrid reading. It overlays voice impersonation, and it's also an intertextual reference to GLaDOS from the digital game, which she's observed being played by her brother. The second thing, isn't this a remarkable 5-year-old? The digital turn in the new literacy studies was the title of this article in Review of Educational Research in 2010, based on G's concept of the social turn. So it's a bit of a pun. Literacy practices are indeed social practices, but they're increasingly mediated by digital technologies. This is a consequence of technological changes and the circulation of text globally, supported by the internet, social media, and mobile devices. Much of the new literacy studies research of literacy practices across different communities around the world was notably describing digital practices by the turn of the century, and certainly by 2010. This digitalization of literacy practices and broader contexts of learning outside of schools has been given greater priority in the COVID-19 pandemic. So what is the new literacy studies? Literacy studies is research based on the socio-cultural theory, of literacy practices that varies by cultural community. Some of the key theorists, and you may be familiar with them, are people like Brian Street, James Paul G, who does video games research, Shirley Bryce Heath, Barton, and many others. Beginning with ethnographies of communication, they showed that different vernacular speech communities have important language practices. And these practices vary and carry meaning through their entrenchment in specific cultural values and orientations. So there's not one universal form of literacy, but rather there are many different communities, each with their own type of literacy practice. For example, many Indigenous communities in Australia use cultural stories, beautiful artwork, songs and dances, which are a vital part of their language culture and their early socialization. So language functions as a tool for interacting with our social environment. Literacy practices are then seen as constructions of particular social groups rather than attributed just to individual cognition. So this is a very different view of language and literacies than the kind that we see emphasized in the media by politicians and when people are talking about standardized testing of literacy around the world. At the turn of the century, scholars of new literacy studies began to draw attention to the many different kinds of literacy practices that were increasingly involving hybrid uses of digital technologies. Now, this leads to a question. Theorists have contended then, if literacies are constantly changing because of the digital media and new platforms and technologies, then what are the boundaries of literacy? If modern technologies are going to make boundaries between modes and media redundant, where do new literacies actually stop? As one commentator has asked, why not count, say, arable farming as a literacy practice? It does mark the landscape and it uses technological advances. Well, the new literacy studies defines literacy as socially organized practices that make use of a symbol system and a technology for producing and disseminating it. When they say technology, it could be pens, pencils, crayons, it could be computers, it could be virtual reality headsets. So technologies is a very broad term. Examples of some of the new literacy practices that we see are things like blogs, infographics, digital comics, social media posts, computer coding, animations, and what we call extended reality texts, which is virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. So that cluster of new practices that are really growing this decade. Textual practices are constantly changing, and these require new skills, new literacy skills, and new technical proficiencies. Samples of the practices that were studied around 2010 included online chat, scripted radio plays, and blogs. Yet often when you look at the practices that were being researched at the time, a lot of them did talk about multiple modes of communication, but they also included words and narration. So when we look at education, it tends to kind of elevate the written mode or the alphabetic literacies above the other modes. However, what was agreed was that conventional forms of reading and writing, for example, reading a book or writing on paper, were no longer adequate to describe the great variety of digital practices that we now use. One of the key debates then was about the in-school, out-of-school literacies. Is this a helpful distinction? There was an emphasis in the new literacy studies on many of the ways that young people use literacy practices outside of school. So the informal things that they're doing online, such as using social media. And this is really common when we look at adolescent literacy practices. These practices are wide-ranged. They're peer and interest-driven. So young people are doing it because they want to, and they're usually in online spaces. Others have cautioned that we need to be careful not to romanticize these out-of-school practices, because there are also many formal literacy practices like extended essay writing and so on with digital technologies that young people still need to learn. Additionally, we can't just homogenize all the experiences of youth, because many actually lack access to basic computer technologies in the home. For example, I was part of a holiday program in Toledo in Ohio in the USA, and we taught kids how to create digital sculptures and make kinetic paintings using Arduino kits, which are little boxes of wires and technologies for kids to construct and code different things. At the end of the program, one of the mothers came up to me and said, "Oh, thank you so much for this Arduino kit that you've allowed my children to keep. Can I use it on their mobile phone?" And I said, no, you'll need a computer for that, or a laptop of some sort. And she said, "Oh, we don't have a computer. We just use our mobile phones to get the Wi-Fi." And so we can't just assume that all young people have access to these rich adolescent out-of-school literacy practices. By the 2010s, there was a growing number of new literacy studies to demonstrate the teaching of digitalized practices of literacy in schools. And so this is really important, because if not all the students are going to get access to these outside of school, we need to bring them into schools and make sure all students have opportunities to use the kinds of literacies that they're going to need in the future workplace. Others have criticised the in-school, out-of-school distinction, and they prefer to talk about this or theorise this as a kind of intergenerational struggle between literacy norms. So what is valued by an older person might not be the same practices that are valued by a younger person or a younger population. So when we look at all of these literacy practices that young people engage with digital media, it raises the question, have authoritative literacies and knowledge actually been destabilized from things like the rise of the internet, from people sharing information on social media? What we've seen is that many new literacy practices are learnt by youth engaging with more experienced co-conspirators online, rather than seeking out traditional authority figures like teachers to gain knowledge or to learn new skills online. The practices that they involve with often have peers who are collaborators. They find online mentors, and they're united by their shared interests. Young people have significant ownership of their online self-presentation, their learning, and their evaluation of others online. And there are many different markers of identity and status in these online communities of practice. There are also new forms of online etiquette, behaviour, and for acceptance by particular groups online. Do these new literacy practices then have academic value? Will they help students in their school lives? Well, this has been studied by researchers by the New Literacy Studies. Some of them have attempted to see if new literacy studies interventions like after-school computer coding programs or Quest Atlantis, which was a massive after-school program in the USA, to see if it yields measurable learning outcomes at school. And they have shown some very successful learning gains over time over a variety of skills using well-designed programs. Many new literacy studies have demonstrated successful ways to integrate multimodal and digital practices both in schools and in after-school programs. And these are aligned with the official curriculum, such as through spoken word poetry, hip-hop, video games, virtual worlds, online chat. They've shown the challenges that teachers encounter too when trying to integrate some of these new literacy practices in classroom environments. An interesting thing to note is that in Australia, where I'm based, the teaching of multimodal literacy, which means reading and writing with many modes, for example, images, words, audio, and other features, is actually a requirement in the curriculum across all years, from students as young as 5 years old right through to 17. This has helped to create a degree of alignment between the kinds of media-based practices that young people engage with outside of school and those that they engage with in school. So another key question or debate that's been raised is that are any of these local literacies that have been observed in homes and communities, are any of them common across the communities? Are there some big trends? A criticism of the New Literacy Studies has been that it describes different literacy practices of communities, but it doesn't map practices across the sites. It's called the limits of looking at the local. Can we look to some useful literacy practices common across many sites without necessarily having to embrace a view that there's one universal type of literacy that everyone must learn? Some of the new literacy studies, like the Digital Youth Network, which is a really important group in the USA, conducted studies to examine how new media practices across different populations are actually embedded in broader patterns of literacy within the United States and connected globally. There are many multi-site studies of literacy practices, and what has emerged was a picture of some of the common features that are emerging across sites and common across the sites. Literacies are becoming more pluralized. That means there's more of them. They're more hybridized, which means that they're different, they're augmented, they blend bits of this one and bits of that text. They're also intertextual, so they're often connected to each other. For example, kids making Minecraft videos and songs that use other songs with the Minecraft game. The practices are often also immediate, so you can interact with other people online. You can have authors and readers interacting in the same space. Written practices like text messaging and social media posts are very spontaneous. They're very abbreviated, they're informal, and they're often collaborative. There's also been different kinds of interactivity. Texts are more hyperlinked and connected to each other across the internet. And they often involve more than one language. So let's have a look at some of these three main features of these literacy practices. The hybridization of textual practices. The blending or modification of literacy practices results in new practices. A good example would be something like relay writing. This is where you can have a blog where each person contributes a small part of a post, say 140 characters, and the next person writes another post, which then can create a bigger story. so a group story. Another example is how years ago we would write personal diaries in a booklet form. But online now we have blogs. We have travel logs called weblogs, shortened later to blogs, which are a hybrid form of doing recounts. So it's just another logging activity, but now it's done online with more pictures and for different social purposes. There's now different types of grammar, different types of orthography or spelling, different vocabulary use, such as abbreviated text messaging and the use of emojis. The second big trend is the creative production of digital media. When we had the rise of the Web 2, this was considered quite a novel element compared to the read-only uses of the internet. For those of you who are old enough to remember pre-2000, when often people would go online and look at websites, but we didn't have social media and a lot of emphasis on producing text. So we saw large interventions like the Computer Clubhouse by Resnick and Rusk that served youth from underprivileged communities, teaching kids creative digital media production. And this operation is still happening today. They have 100 clubhouses in 21 countries. By the 2010s, people were making their own websites on things like WordPress. They were hosting their own blogs. They were sharing their own images and memes on the internet. In educational sites, we saw increasing examples of teachers and students using more sophisticated tools for digital production, lots of video creation, robotics, music remixing, coding, and animation creation. And these were often very creative, intertextual, and were co-constructed with others. Another key feature was that many of these online literacy practices were collaborative communities. So these collaborative communities have been called affinity groups by James G. because they have an affinity or shared interests. Communities like this value distributed expertise among the members. Think of, for example, a video game fan site. So you could go to, say, a Minecraft wiki where you can find information about Minecraft, or you can go to fan sites where you can find the very latest knowledge from your peers about different tips and tricks and Minecraft skins and all the ins and outs of the game. There were new collaborative writing tools. So we got things like Google Docs where people could collaborate online in the same document. There was greater visible connectivity between the text and the users. And we saw some texts gaining much wider audiences online. At the same time, educators tackled new complexities associated with collaborative writing assessments. How are we going to assess when lots of people have contributed to a text, particularly at the college level? One of the big criticisms of the new literacy studies that I also looked at was the criticism that the new literacy studies have emphasised literacy practices for leisure that are only accessible to a few people. So I reviewed the studies in 2010 to see if there were more examples of new literacies conducted by middle-class participants in well-resourced countries compared to other marginalised groups. And what I found was actually the opposite. There were actually more examples of new literacy studies conducted with culturally diverse groups and economically marginalised groups than with the privileged. And the social justice agenda in these studies was very strong. New literacy studies had included research from Spain, Uganda, Brazil, South Africa, Greece, Rwanda, and rural China, rural Vietnam, and rural Cambodia, to name a few locations. And the research highlighted some of the challenges that literacy educators and researchers have in places like Uganda. There, the out-of-school literacy practices are not rich, they're not frequent, and they're often not digitally mediated. They also found that simply giving access to technology or just doing a short-term study or a short-term intervention was not actually enough, and it doesn't necessarily translate to literacy success for many of these marginalised groups. So one of the new questions that I've been considering since doing this review is the question about whether young children are making new media, or is new media making them? In digital media environments of recent years, we've seen that algorithms and automation are now involved in a host of processes inside the black box. Algorithms are used to target advertisements based on predictive analytics, filtering information and generating relevant content. Websites track the user's digital footprints, while providers are data mining. They're profiling users who are often very young children. Attentional and behavioural engineering are being used to bring users back to websites or apps, to engage for longer, to click more, to make more purchases, while research has demonstrated how social media news feeds can personalise content and manipulate emotions, even without the users really being aware. So teachers need to help students see how seemingly innocuous data, such as social media feeds, search results, and YouTube recommendations, can be manipulated by predictive analytics. The user's past online activity creates what's being called echo chambers, where users' personal interests, from surprise eggs to political views, are amplified, and they're reverberated in endless cycles to reinforce rather than to challenge beliefs. Students today need to be taught new literacies of the algorithmic kind to understand how predictive analytics are used to build rich profiles of users and to target users with content and advertising. These algorithms are well-hidden secrets of large technology companies and social media sites, and with infinite data input, it's impossible to trace how automated results are actually produced. So algorithm-based media is used to influence judgments, emotions, and spread misinformation, while AI technologies of the second machine age include image and speech recognition and radical technologies that are based on neural networks and machine learning algorithms, not on traditional coding and programming by computer scientists. In an age of machine learning, literacy needs to include knowledge and tools to critique and understand the mechanisms and consequences of algorithm-driven media, including the decreased privacy associated with their use. So what will be the literacies of the future? We can see trends in literacy practices that have already begun, supported by the widespread accessibility of mobile phones and the social web, and rapid developments in virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. Extended reality technologies include VR, AR, and MR. They extend from these, and we've yet to see what is expected to be a rapidly developing area of technology this decade. But a useful way to think about new digital practices for literacy is the extent to which these new practices are simply a substitute form of a conventional or traditional literacy practice, like reading digital versus an analog clock, or whether literacy practices are radically transformed. So we can look at this simple model here called the SAMR model. We can see that some technologies like, for example, dictionary.com function as almost a direct substitute for the print version, such as carrying around a pocket dictionary. Then there are technologies that will actually augment literacy practice, but with functional improvements. For example, reading an ebook that's lightweight, interactive, searchable, has shareable content, and has compact storage. Moving up the model, we have modification. So this could be technology that allows significant literacy task redesign. For example, have you tried painting in 3D using virtual reality, using motion sensors, or have you coded an animated narrative in Scratch? Finally, we can look to redefinition. This is where digital tech allows for the creation of a new literacy practice that was previously inconceivable. So something radically different. For example, I've recently been exploring the HoloLens 2 mixed reality headset and encouraged some students to make narratives using 3D holograms, using biomes and characters and props and putting them in a 3D model that you can only see through the headset. And they do that using in-ear haptics. It's very different to conventional literacy practices. So this continuum is not a set of inflexible categories, but rather a range of practices that have greater or lesser resemblance to conventional forms of literacy as we've known it in the past. So in sum, any new vision for literacy practices, digital or not, needs to be founded on a social justice perspective that continues to respect diversity in cultural communities and works towards a more equitable and just society. If you'd like to connect with me, I have a website called sensorstogether.com, which has one of my newer projects, and my Twitter handles there, and also my Facebook. And for some additional reading, I've recently published Literacy for Digital Futures, which just came out this year, actually the end of last year, and is now available open access as well. If you Google it and go to the Routledge publication site, it has an open access link where you can download the whole book for free. And that was co-authored with Len Unsworth and Laura Scholes. In that book, we talk about literacy for digital futures, mind, body, text. And the book is divided into those three areas, looking at how new literacy practices can have changed the way we think, that's mind, how we use our bodies, and that's body, and our body-mind connection because of the way our body influences the way we think, and also text. So looking at the new types of grammars and new textual features of literacy practices for those interested in language. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing. And now I can see you again.